Jacob chapter 5. This is a complicated chapter. In fact, it's so complicated that Jacob started to feel what before he even talked about it? Anxious. He's like, I'm going to explain to you guys how you can be restored to God, because right now you're distancing from God, but it's going to be complicated, and hopefully I don't mess up, because he's about to share a story with them from the brass plates. And it's a story, it's a parable about the allegory of the olive tree from the prophet Zenos. And this teaches us how all of us can return to the Lord. But it uses a lot of imagery. It kind of feels like we're reading an Isaiah chapter again with this one. But the reason people really like this chapter is because it's impossible for a 21-year-old farm boy with no formal really schooling and education to ever write something this spiritually complex. Joseph Smith. If people think he was just some guy who wrote a book in a cabin somewhere and people just started following him, this is the chapter that shows that someone who was only inspired by God could ever write something like this. But to really understand it, we kind of need to understand the symbolism that's going on in this allegory, right? To kind of make sense of all of it. And there's two things to remember. The objects represent things in real life, so we have to understand what the objects represent. And the events that are happening in the allegory, in the parable, describe events that have happened over the course of history. Basically, the Lord of the vineyard, or the person who owns the vineyard, is going to make a number of visits to his vineyard, and he's going to talk to his servants in the vineyard to see how the work is going. Sometimes the Lord of the vineyard will even work with them in doing the work, and he's directing all of this work in his vineyard. So the first visit that we read about in this allegory is about the things that were happening before the life of Jesus Christ. So verses 3 to 14 of this allegory are talking about things that are happening before the life of Jesus Christ. For the next few verses, 15 to 28, it's the second visit of the Lord of the vineyard to his vineyard of olive trees. And this represents things that were happening during the time of Christ. So Christ, his apostles, it represents events that were happening during that time. Then the Lord of the vineyard comes back for a third visit in this parable. And this represents the period of events after the life of Christ. What happened to the apostles, the church, after Christ returned to heaven?
Great apostasy.
The great apostasy, very good. So the third visit, verses 29 to 49, talk about the great apostasy and what it was like during that time. Then there's a fourth visit, which is verses 50 to 76, which is the fourth visit of the Lord of the vineyard. And what were the events that happened after the great apostasy? What period of time came next? The restoration of the church. Very good. So verses 50 to 76 represent the restoration of the gospel. And what's the next big event that comes after this period of the restoration of the gospel?
Coming?
And that starts what period of time?
Millennium.
The millennium. So the last just two verses of this long chapter of 77 verses, just verses 76 and 77, touch on the millennium. It basically walks us through this entire history of God's people. And it does it in this beautiful, kind of heartfelt story. But those are two things. So we talked about the events. Now we need to talk about the objects. What do the objects themselves represent? What does the vineyard itself represent?
Isn't the vineyard the world?
That is correct. The vineyard represents the whole world and all the what?
People.
All the people in it, right? So the tame olive tree is the house of Israel, God's covenant people, the people who follow the Lord. And the wild olive tree are people who don't know about the Lord, don't follow the Lord, Gentiles, people who aren't part of God's covenant people. So the branches that move back and forth represent. Okay. It's at some point it's going to talk about the roots of the tame olive tree. And what roots us in the gospel? What is
our faith, our testimony.
Our faith in him and his
gospel
and kind of keeping the commandments, right? So that's the roots of the tame olive tree. What do the olives, the fruit olives themselves represent? It's the thing we produce or actually do. It's our what?
Trees.
Our doings, our works. So these are the works. Whether they're righteous or wicked works, the fruit represents the works of people. Gardeners who are digging, pruning, fertilizing the trees. Fertilizing the trees.
People teaching the gospel to others.
So the people who are digging, pruning, fertilizing the trees, those are people doing God's work. Very good. Transplanting the branches, moving the branches from one tree to another tree. He's spreading groups of people throughout his vineyard.
Scattering them.
The
scattering of Israel.
Very good. And the grafting, actually joining a branch to a tree. What does that represent?
Gathering to the church.
Very good. Branches that are decaying and dying off represent.
Ignoring the prophets, not going to church.
Wickedness and apostasy. So the last one is casting branches into the fire.
Cutting them from the presence of God.
Judgments from God is correct. All right, guys, that's pretty good. Kind of makes sense what's going on. So Jacob is going to do his best to teach the allegory of the olive tree from the prophet Zenos. This is all about the scattering and gathering of what?
Israel.
And when we think about that, we think of people being spread through the world due to God's judgments or whatever reason it is, and then being gathered together to what?
The church.
The church, right? And that's correct, but not entirely correct. When we're gathered to the church, who are we gathered to? The Lord, the Savior, right? And being gathered to the church on this earth represents that one day we'll be gathered where?
To heaven.
To heaven. That's the ultimate goal, guys. It's not being gathered to the church. The church is part of the path of being gathered, hopefully one day where?
To heaven.
To heaven. But what is it that has caused us to be scattered from the presence of God?
Sin.
Sin. So the way we're gathered back to Heavenly Father is we have to overcome what?
Sin.
Sin. And what is it that has overcome sin for those who are faithful?
Atonement.
Is atonement. That's what gathers us. So this is less a story about missionary work, and of course it is a story about missionary, but it's really a story about the atonement and what the Lord of the vineyard has done for all of those branches in his vineyard. If you break up the word atonement into three parts, what are the parts? At. What's the next word?
No.
One, and
Oh,
then
one.
meant, right? It's an at-one-ment. Basically, it's called an atonement because it takes all of us who are different and sinful and brings us into what?
One.
One.
At one meant full
At
place.
one meant. It makes us one with him in Heavenly Father. So you guys will see when the Lord of the vineyard is talking, sometimes he's going to talk with a lot of emotion. And what did he do for us? Did he sacrifice a lot for us?
Yes.
So when he sees his trees not bearing fruit and doing good works, how does he feel?
Sad.
Really sad, right? And we'll kind of see that as we go through. Verse 1.
Behold, my brethren, do ye not remember to have read the words of the prophet Zenos, which he spake unto the house of Israel, saying,
So whose
that's
words are
kind of
these?
straightforward. Zenos' words.
So Nephi taught the words of
Isaiah.
and Jacob is teaching the words of
Zenos.
Zenos. So they would take the scriptures and what the scriptures taught and apply it to their own what?
Like,
Their own life. Which means when we read the scriptures
we need to liken them
to
our own lives.
our own lives, right?
Hearken, O ye house of Israel, and hear the words of me, a prophet of the Lord.
Who's talking right now?
Jacob.
Err.
Wait, no, Zenos.
Zenos,
No.
yeah.
For behold, thus saith the Lord, I will liken thee, O house of Israel, like to a tame olive tree, which a man took and nourished in his vineyard, and it grew and waxed old and began to decay.
Tame olive tree, covenant people. A man planted it and it grew.
And did he nourish it?
Yes.
Who is that man?
God.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Jesus Christ. He established his church,
so
and it's from Jesus Christ who's nourishing it.
It nourished and it began to grow, and then it started to decay.
Wicked stuff.
Who started to do the bad stuff?
The church members.
How do you think the Lord was feeling?
Sad. They've been in the church for years and years and years.
So did they know better?
Yes.
And they chose righteousness or wickedness?
Wickedness.
And is this the time before, during, or after the life of Christ?
Before.
Even though they had the prophets, they had the teachings, They knew it for years and years. What's an example of a city that was destroyed before Christ even came? Jerusalem. So this story probably means a lot to the Nephites, right? Because they just left where? Jerusalem, a city that had decayed and was judged of the Lord. And it came to pass that the master of the vineyard, who's that? Jesus went forth, and he saw that his olive tree began to decay. And the people were doing bad things, even though he was trying to help them. And he said, I will prune it and dig about it and nourish it. Did he want to give up on his tree?
No.
No, he was going to keep trying. That perhaps it may shoot forth young and tender branches. What kind of branches? Healthy, good, righteous branches, or more wicked branches?
Healthy, good, righteous
Okay.
branches.
And it perish not. So is Jesus hopeful that he can get his people back on track?
Yeah.
But can he force it?
No.
No, we have our free what?
Agency.
Our free agency. God doesn't force us to be righteous.
And it came to pass that he pruned it and digged about it and nourished it according to his word. So he cared about it and taught it. Taught the people.
To his what?
Word.
His word, meaning his what?
Gospel.
His gospel. Very good.
And it came to pass that after many days it began to put forth somewhat a little young and tender branches. But behold, the main top thereof began to perish.
So what was happening to some of the members of the church?
Some of the members of the church were like growing back in.
They're being what? They were being what?
Righteous.
Righteous.
And then like at the top it said it was all like the wicked people, so that like started to like die.
And when you feel like you're on top of everyone, what's that called? Why were they decaying? Because of their what?
Prideful.
What is it? Because they were being what?
Prideful.
And is this before his life, during his life, or after his life?
After.
Before.
Before. Very good.
And it came to pass that the master of the vineyard saw it, and he said unto his servant, It grieveth me that I should lose this tree. Wherefore go and pluck the branches from a wild olive tree, and bring them hither unto me. And we will pluck off those main branches which are beginning to wither away, and we will cast them into the fire that they may be burned.
He's bringing
Punishing.
in to saying, you don't get this land anymore. And I'm giving it to who?
Person. And I'm punishing
What
you.
group of people?
Of the Gentiles.
The Gentiles.
And I'm punishing you.
Was there a small group of righteous people in Jerusalem?
Yeah.
Were they the young, tender branches, but most of the city was destroyed?
Yeah.
What did God do with that small group of righteous people?
He spread them.
He took them out of Jerusalem and brought them where?
From Rome.
Some came to the promised land, others were sent to other places, right? 7 is referring to the fact that the house of Israel was no longer righteous. There was a few righteous people that God was going to take away from there. And he was going to give the land of the house of Israel to
The Gentiles.
the Gentiles. And behold, saith the Lord of the vineyard, I take away many of these young and tender branches, and I will graft them whithersoever I will.
I'm going to send them wherever I want to.
And it mattereth not that if it so be that the root of this tree will perish, I may preserve the fruit thereof unto myself. Wherefore I will take these young and tender branches, and I will graft them whithersoever I will. So even though my main church is going to get lost because of the wickedness of the people, and I'm going to give this land to the Gentiles, I'm still going to preserve a righteous group, and my root will still be preserved in these other groups that I'm going to spread throughout the world. No one could write this stuff without the inspiration of the Lord. It's just, you couldn't just sit down and write something like this. And Joseph Smith did the translation in like 2.5 months. It was like 10 weeks. Meaning this section, he probably would have spent just a couple of days on. Who was inspiring all of this? The Lord was, right?
Take down the branches of the wild olive tree, and graft them in the stead thereof, and these which I plucked off I will cast into the fire and burn them, that they may not cumber the ground of my vineyard. So he took the Gentiles and put them into their land, and took out the wicked people from the land.
And they were what?
Destroyed.
They were destroyed.
And it came to pass that the servant of the Lord of the vineyard did according to the word of the Lord of the vineyard, and grafted in the branches of the wild olive.
So the prophets were actually the ones bringing in the Gentiles. They were the ones delivering the message. If you guys don't repent,
the Gentiles are coming in hot.
God is going to give your land to the
Gentiles.
right?
Servants were warning them. And the Lord of the vineyard caused that it should be digged about and pruned and nourished, saying unto his servant, It grieveth me that I should lose this tree. Wherefore, that perhaps I might preserve the roots thereof, that they perish not, that I might preserve them unto myself, I have done this thing.
So he didn't want it to happen, but it had to happen.
According to God's law of
Justice.
Just look at the word, guys. It grieveth me.
What does grieve it?
It makes me
It's
really
sad.
sad. Really, really
Like
sad
it pains me to have to do this.
to lose this tree.
Do you think Heavenly Father likes punishing his people?
No.
Break a rule,
You didn't get it.
you know, there's a punishment that comes.
But basically, he couldn't just let his church continue the way it was. And those few groups of righteous people, he had to what?
Take them.
He had to get them out of there to try to at least preserve
His righteous people.
his righteous people. Wherefore go thy way. Who's he talking to? The
Servants.
servant. Watch the tree and nourish it according to my words. He's saying, go and teach my words, which is my
Gospel.
gospel, right? He's trying to spiritually strengthen and nourish this tree again.
This chapter reminds me of life, because there's more wicked people in the world than righteous.
Kind of that small number of young, tender branches. Okay.
A lot of the world is a lot of wicked,
Uh-huh.
and then like little groups of people righteous.
And God is trying to preserve
That group. And these will I place in the nether.
He's
He's gonna put them in the Minecraft version.
It just means outside of the main part. The nether means outside.
And these will I place in the nethermost part of my vineyard. Whithersoever I will, it mattereth not unto thee, and I do it that I may preserve unto myself the natural branches of the tree, and also that I may lay up the fruit thereof against the season unto myself. For it grieveth me that I should lose this tree and the fruit thereof.
So what if Jeremiah said, hey Lord, where are you sending Lehi and all these other and his family? Where are they going? What is the Lord basically saying here?
We don't know.
Yeah, don't worry about it. You just go preach my word. I'm going to spread these people out whithersoever I will. So just trust that I'm doing what's best for my church and my people. So sometimes God moves his people around without other people knowing why or his reasons for it, but we're trusting that he's doing it and kind of all this work to kind of bring about his great purposes in the end. So we just want to trust him.
And it came to pass that the Lord of the vineyard went his way and hid the natural branches of the tame olive tree in the nethermost parts of the vineyard, some in one and some in another, according to his will and pleasure. And he hid the young and tender branches
And he spread them out where? Throughout the whole what?
world.
The whole world, that's right. So this could be referring to the lost 10 tribes of Israel. But why do you think Jacob is teaching this to the Nephites? Who else is this referring to? Them. What do you mean them?
Because they were like one of the groups that were scattered.
Exactly. So Jacob is doing this because it's talking about them, right? So these are the events before the time of Christ. The next section of verses is going to talk about what period of time?
Christ's birth.
Yeah, during the life of Christ, right? The Lord of the vineyard actually coming to do more in his garden because he's going to be there in what?
He's gonna be there in person.
And we're going to see kind of what that's like when we go to that next section, guys. Nice job.